The Dr. Taz Show, the podcast. Dr. Taz, Superwoman Wellness. Here's Dr. Taz.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of Superwoman Wellness, where I am determined to bring you back to your superpowered self. And before I introduce my fabulous guest, I can't wait to tell you about her, I wanted to remind you guys about something. I am now offering a free bottle of Boost. That's my energy booster, full of B vitamins. It's like the perfect women's multi. Men can take it too. If you post a review. So if you post a review on Spotify, you can email us at hello@drtaz.com and we will get that sent out to you. But let's get to it and get to the guest at hand, who is also a friend, and she's amazing. She's beautiful, she's brilliant, but she's an innovator in the field of muscle and the importance of muscle when it comes to longevity and even the immune system. I want you guys to meet Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. I call her Dr. Gabby. She's a Washington University fellowship trained physician in nutritional science and geriatrics, and she's board certified in family medicine and osteopathic manipulation. She completed her undergraduate degree in human nutrition, vitamin and mineral metabolism at the University of Illinois. She works closely with the Special Operations Military and has a private practice in New York City. In addition, her practice serves the leaders, the innovators, mavericks, executives in their respective fields, and she brings unparalleled results to her patients with her personalized advanced nutritional interventions, metabolic and genetic testing, and behavioral action implementation. I'm reading this and I'm like, I need to go see her professionally. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you so much. Funny you mentioned that. I do see a lot of our mutual professionals. So
we do. I know we share a couple, and I have, as you already know, admired your work over the years. You've been on the show before, but you continue to amaze me with everything that you're doing and putting out there. So tell folks, if they missed our last episode with you, tell them a little bit about you and how you got into this sort of area of the importance of the muscle and how it's an organ that we often ignore and how it's connected to so many different aspects of our health.
Yes. So the kind of medicine I practice is called muscle-centric medicine. And it was really born out of my experience. There was a time during my fellowship at WashU. So I did a combined fellowship. I did clinical research and then practice. And part of that was obesity medicine. And we imaged this woman's brain, and she was in her 40s, had 3 kids. And it showed flattening of her gray matter. She's in her 40s. And I knew at that moment that 2 decades later, she was going to have Alzheimer's or some kind of cognitive impairment. And I realized that it was really based on her body composition. A lot of the literature would suggest that the wider the waistline, there is a lower brain volume. There is an effect on brain volume. And it was at that moment that I realized that body composition, in particular muscle mass, skeletal muscle, was really the key to longevity. And that we had the wrong focus. We are focused on an obesity epidemic kind of paradigm,
right?
But we have a failure of that. That's a symptomology of impaired muscle. So the muscle tissue becomes impaired decades before.
Wow.
Obesity becomes a problem.
And how do we know this? Like so many of us, we're exercising, we're doing all the things we think we're supposed to be doing. I can see someone saying, well, I work out, I lift weights. What do you mean? Like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So how has this come about when the fitness craze, seems to have escalated over the last 20, 30 years? Why are we having such a problem with the health of our muscles?
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. And, muscle tissue changes. And oftentimes we think about skeletal muscle as it just relates to locomotion and looking good in a bikini, right? That is the primary thought, or let's go, But that's only a small subset of actually what muscle does. So muscle, when you contract healthy muscle, it actually functions as an endocrine organ. When you contract it, it secretes myokines, which are proteins and substances that are released from the muscle that travel throughout the body that have immune modulatory effects. So they affect cells, they affect your immune system, cells of the immune system. It affects the way in which you utilize nutrients. It affects inflammation. It actually counters the effect of visceral fat, which is adiposity. So your question was, why, with all the exercise that's happening, why do we still struggle with poor quality muscle?
Right.
Well, Interestingly, we're not over fat. We are under muscled. And muscle changes decades before, years before you become diabetic. Type 2 diabetes is actually a disease of skeletal muscle.
Fascinating.
So we have spent decades looking at obesity, adipose tissue, as opposed to actually looking at skeletal muscle. Why is there a challenge? Well, muscle is stimulated by two very discrete processes. Number one, dietary protein. And number two, rightly targeted resistance training. That's it. So those are the two ways really effectively to stimulate skeletal muscle. What's happened is people eat and train the way that they did in their 20s.
Right.
And the dosing of the protein is suboptimal to actually create a subsequent muscle protein synthesis and actual triggering of the tissue, which you need. So you need to think about eating dietary protein as a take-home point in a bolus amount per meal so that you actually can stimulate your muscle tissue. And this is not a concept that is really talked about.
It's not talked about at all. And I hope everybody caught that, you're calling type 2 diabetes a disease of the muscle, not a disease of the pancreas, not a disease of insulin, not a disease of being overweight. And many of us, like myself included, we focus so much on the gut and the liver and that relationship and how it drives insulin. How did this happen? Like, why is this such an issue now? Is it because we're just all sitting more? We're on computers, we're sitting more, we have sedentary jobs. Is that the reason we're losing muscle? When does this happen? Is it really a concern for people once they cross that? I haven't done it yet, but once they cross that 29-ish threshold,
Right. We've not done that yet. So it's so interesting.
But when is this all like coming together? So somebody like me, a doctor who's taking care of people, and maybe they've got a big history and a lot of genetics in their family that I need to be aware of, that I could latch onto this a little bit faster, because we do look at muscle mass, but maybe we're not looking at it critically. So I know I've asked you like 3 questions in one statement, but anyhow, so break it down.
So the first step is understanding that we have a failure of the fat-focused paradigm is the wrong perspective. And that's why the recidivism rate, the relapse rate is so prevalent and so common, is because the actual paradigm of thinking about it is wrong. When we shift our understanding that insulin resistance starts in the skeletal muscle tissue. Insulin resistance starts in the skeletal muscle tissue and then creates elevated blood glucose, diabetes, hypertension, Alzheimer's. The reason this happens is I want you to think of skeletal muscle as a suitcase.
Right.
So if you are eating excess calories, excess carbohydrates, you're filling up the suitcase, which is your muscle. So muscle is where you dispose of glucose. It is one of the largest sites for glucose disposal. Glucose meaning carbohydrates. So when you are overpacking it and overfilling it, everything spills back into the bloodstream. The muscle can't use it all. So now you've got free fatty acids and glucose spilling back into the bloodstream, and glucose is cytotoxic. So that's where it starts. If you really think about the core, it's insulin resistance starts in the muscle. So the next question you asked me is, why now? Well, and when does it start? Well, it starts in your 30s when you have a decrease in hormones. So one of the other things that drives muscle mass is hormonal status. I didn't mention that. So I mentioned the things that you can do to promote it and protect it, which is dietary protein and resistance exercise. But what helps improve it is hormonal status. Testosterone, even estrogen. That changes as we get older. Interestingly, and that can be in our 30s, right? So if you are not eating a robust amount of protein, a minimum of 30 grams per meal, then you're actually not stimulating the tissue. So you combined a decrease in hormones with improper dosing of protein. So it's like a sub-threshold. You never stimulate the tissue with any kind of chronic inflammation or inactivity and just not moving the way that we did. Muscle tissue declines, right? It's this concept of sarcopenia so sarcopenia is a decrease in muscle mass and strength and even size, right? So we've all seen it. Like our parents get tiny, right? It's a change in the muscle mass. And then subsequently, what also happens is you get fat infiltration into the tissue, right? You also get anabolic resistance. So the body becomes less efficient at utilizing dietary protein and responding to exercise.
I think all of this is so important. Now, what metrics would you use to help somebody start to pick up on the fact? There are, of course, lab metrics, right, where you can look at your hormone levels. And, we've talked about that a lot on the show and even, in different arenas.
And you're about to bring up a really great point.
Well,
so I'm just going to say, you're about to bring up a really great point here.
Yeah. So like, how do we, who wants to wait to get diabetes and Alzheimer's and all these other diseases of inflammation that you and I talk about all the time? None of us want to that point. And then especially the clientele you're talking about. And for any other mom, busy person, like we want to be ahead of the game. We don't want to be behind the game and not feeling good all the time. So what are the metrics? Like, how do we look? We know we can test hormones. We know we can look at those levels.
Yes.
We know we can measure body fat and muscle mass and things like that.
But do we, I just want to stop you here because this is a very brilliant point, is that we know the amount of body fat that can be detrimental.
Right.
We have no concept about, I have no concept about how much muscle mass you should have to be optimal.
Wow. Why?
Exactly, because this goes back to the point where we have been focused on the wrong paradigm.
Right.
We know everything about the problem, right? So we've been we've been so focused on the negativity that we have completely missed the solution. So there are not charts or evidence that would say, you know what, Dr. Lyon, I know that at 5'1" and 125 pounds, you should be this much muscle mass. We have no idea.
We need to create those.
Yes, in my spare time. Yes. But it's so interesting. So the concept that you asked is, I mean, how can we do it? We can do imaging, which can be invasive. So you can see the quality of tissue, on more, on higher levels of imaging. You could, of course, do a DEXA. Is that practical? It's not really practical. So the thing that I would say is that really tracking your capacity to perform, and this is purely anecdotal. So now we're talking about, over 10 years in practice, seeing patients, being a geriatrician by training. We used to track walking speed and grip strength, but that, if you really were to critically think about it, that is really about an aging population. And you and I both know how medicine works. It's like, well, here's the minimum and here's the maximum. And it's not really based on optimal health, right?
No. Yeah.
So I think really having a well-designed resistance program, a well-designed program where you're exercising, your weights are improving, you're maintaining a VO2 max. So VO2 max declines with muscle mass, right? People think VO2 max declines with age, which quite possibly, yes, but it actually parallels muscle mass.
So tomorrow, if I go out and I hire a trainer, because I'm concerned about, my muscle mass, I should be tracking multiple things, right? I should be tracking where my skeletal muscles. So we do something called the InBody in practice.
So we do the InBody too. It's a great tool. It's a bioimpedance tool. It's great. It's a great tool because it allows for competency of tracking, right? Competency.
Do you have a goal for that on that InBody, like where it says skeletal muscle? Do you have a goal or a range that you can generalize, or not really?
So, it has metrics on there, but I have to say, just based on clinical practice, I haven't found that to be incredibly helpful because, like my SEALs that I take care of, I mean, their muscle mass is so much higher than their body fat percentage. What is their optimal? I don't know if anyone could say, but I would say it's really important to track body fat. It's also very important to track muscle mass and improvements in muscle mass, right? So the less an individual is trained, the more muscle mass they're going to put on quickly, right? Because you're giving them dietary protein, you have a well-designed resistance training plan, and then the more well-trained an individual, the slower the progression is going to be. So yes, you track body fat, track skeletal muscle, you track inflammatory measures, CRP, SED rate. Those are the big ones. Obviously the hormones, but really tracking fasting insulin. It's important.
All great ones to look at. And now you've mentioned more than once the importance of protein.
Yes.
And I want to dive into that a little bit because we're in an era where a lot of people are fasting, a lot of people are vegan or vegetarian.
Yes.
Keto is doing this, becoming like super popular. And everyone is trying, when I sit back and try to get a, like a 360-degree view of all of this, I feel like all of these are an attempt to deal with insulin resistance, right? What is your opinion of these fads in general, diets in general, some of which really work, right? Intermittent fasting, I'm a fan of, I'll do every
Totally.
now and then. But what is your opinion? How are they working? How do they tie into the concept of building muscle when protein is so central to the argument of building muscle? Help
Right.
us with that and help us answer the vegan vegetarian question, which many people may have.
Yeah. Let's start with fasting. The concept of fasting is great. And really, fasting allows for calorie control. It allows for bowel rest. It allows really for a circadian entrainment. And, in my clinic, I recommend an 8 to 9 hour fast. 8 to 9 hour feeding window, a 16-hour fast.
Yep.
So the next question, which is going to be surprising, is I'm going to wonder, how old is the person? As you age, the tissue becomes much less efficient. It's called anabolic resistance. There's an impaired efficiency of skeletal muscle. If you are not very strategic in how you are feeding it, when you go through periods of fasting, which is arguably catabolic, meaning it breaks down tissue, you destroy muscle mass. If you're young and you're training and you're doing resistance exercise, then you can maintain that skeletal muscle. But if you are going through any kind of menopausal change and you don't have hormones on board, if you are over the age of 60, even if you're in your late 50s, and now you're putting in fasting before you're thinking about optimizing protein and muscle tissue, it's the wrong strategy.
Wow.
It is counterproductive. And so it's interesting when I take a step back and I think about our community.
Right.
It's not defined in aging. Right. So it's basically, whether it's paleo or whatever it is, people think that you're all the same. Oh, you're going through hormonal changes. But someone who's aging in late 50s, even mid 50s, that's a totally different ballgame.
Yeah.
The recommendations are different. And it's very important to understand that protein is the most important macronutrient to protect this tissue. It's a non-negotiable.
Wow.
So fasting, so you asked me, so if you're young and healthy and you're training a lot, you can fast.
Okay.
If you are going through menopause and you do not have hormones on board, menopause is one of the time points in where women lose muscle mass very rapidly. This is not the time to fast.
Shouldn't be fasting. So for those women, which again, it's so variable, it's all the way from 40 to 55, what would you tell them? How much protein should they, you mentioned getting it in 30 grams every time you eat.
Minimum.
Minimal.
Yep.
How much protein should they be getting in, and how? Eating chicken breasts 3 or 4 times a day or a massive steak. So how do you see this becoming a little bit more realistic?
Palatable? Yeah. A very common question. And it really, number one, you have to change your mind. Individuals have to change their mind frame. It's very hard for women to eat a bunch of protein. It's really not the go-to. I've heard this. I heard this while I was doing research. The baseline recommendation that I make all my patients, so this is what I give them, and this is higher than the RDA, higher than what is recommended, is 1 gram per pound ideal body weight.
Okay.
Which is very high for people. So I'm 120 pounds, 25 pounds. I eat 125 grams of protein a day.
Wow. And how do you do that?
So I split it up. So
give us your menu, Dr. Gabby.
So I split it up, right? Again, if I'm eating 120 grams, I make sure that 2 meals have so basically the key is whatever your optimal protein amount is, determining that first, and then dividing it into meals that have a minimum of 30 grams up to 50 grams of protein. Okay. So you could easily I could eat 2 times a day, or 2 big meals. So let's say I have 50 grams at each meal, and then I have another smaller meal of 20 grams. That's perfectly acceptable. And I actually do that in a fasted window. So I will do a compressed feeding window, and that works really well. people don't have to go as high as their ideal body weight. You can definitely go lower, but I would say the minimum I recommend for anyone would be at least 90 grams.
90 grams.
At least.
For you, eating 90 grams twice a day, is that
no, total, 90 grams total.
I'm sorry, 90 grams total.
Yeah.
So it's 45. So are you doing like a protein shake and like just some examples?
Yeah. So when you think about protein dosing, for every 1 gram of protein, there's about 7 grams of protein. So for every 1 ounce of protein. Mm-hmm. So for 1 ounce, there's 7 grams of protein per 1 ounce. So if you have a 5 ounce steak, 5 times 7 is you've now hit 35 grams of protein.
Gotcha.
So that would be an example. Also, I do a lot of scrambled eggs. I do a lot of bison. I'll do salmon. If I'm not really hungry, a whey protein shake works well. And you can actually go much lower in the amount of protein because the amino acid profile is so good. Mm-hmm. And if you are vegan or vegetarian, you can get a rice pea blend shake. Just make sure that the amino acids, and that's probably that should be part 2 of the discussion, but it's really important to understand. It's really about, we eat for amino acids, which I won't get into, are just the building blocks of what make up the protein. And that's why the quality of protein is so important, because you're actually eating for the amino acids, and the amino acids in quinoa is different than the amino acid profile in beef. So that's really important to understand that the essential amino acids are different. So that would be an example of what I would eat. I definitely do shakes once in a while. And yeah, I keep it really simple. So beef, bison, chicken, salmon, whitefish.
What about like nuts and seeds and things like that? Are they like their amino acid profile? Is that helping contribute to the pot?
So I don't actually look at it as a protein source. I look at it as a fat source, because the branched chain amino acids, the essential amino acids, are much lower. So for example, if we were to take the example of quinoa, which people talk about as a higher protein, non-meat-based source, it would take about 6 cups of quinoa to equal 1 small chicken breast if you compared the amino acids.
Wow. So what is somebody who is vegan or vegetarian, how are they supposed to get, the right sort of profile of amino acids? What's your thought on that? And then kind of a similar question, you mentioned nuts and fat, like even keto, like where does that fit into the picture?
Yeah, so keto is largely 70% fat, and it is muscle sparing, but it's not, my training is protein metabolism. It's not what I feel is optimal. It's not what, there's a lot of research. There's decades of research out there supporting high quality protein as it relates to body composition, and other subsequent effects, because the amino acids are very powerful. Right. I'll give you an example. For people with high blood pressure, one of the amino acids called arginine is a precursor for nitric oxide, which causes vasodilation. Right. If you're getting a subthreshold amount of protein, the body doesn't even care about your blood pressure. It's just trying to regenerate itself. Wow. So if you now push the needle to get a more optimal amount of protein, the amino acids can be utilized to do other things. And that's really important to understand. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of these amino acids too are hormone builders, like arginine builds testosterone. And so we get into that loop. Now, one piece of this puzzle though, the folks that don't have good gut health, that do have a sluggish liver, where, like when you're thinking about the order in which to approach things, do they really tackle gut liver health first and then increase protein and then balance hormones? Is that kind of like the sequence to go down, or what do you think?
So amino acids are necessary for detoxification. The amino acids are precursor for glutathione, which is the ultimate detoxifier. So when an individual has a sluggish liver, what makes the most sense is actually to provide the amino acids that allow for increasing glutathione. In addition, the enterocytes, the cells of the gut, require glutamine. They require amino acids. And just to take it one step further, when you think about cells of the immune system, they also require amino acids. They require amino acids before they go to glucose. So I think that what we're dealing with is a impaired narrative. We've had a lot of negative press about protein.
Yes.
And when you take a step back, we really have to, if we really want to change the paradigm of thinking, we as a collective group have to take a step back and realize that we cannot demonize this food group that actually has supported us for millions and millions of years. It's actually the key to health, and it's so emotional impact that it has for people. And I totally get that. But we've been really fed an incorrect narrative.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that narrative is coming from just like the wheat narrative and the dairy narrative. A lot of it is just coming from the pure sort of disgustingness that manufacturing practices, farming practices had taken on for years, right? But when things are done correctly and humanely and with respect to nature and the earth and all the stuff, it not only benefits, animals and plants, but it benefits us and the planet, at the same time. So I think that's a lot of where that particular narrative came from. So, hopefully everyone's understanding how important muscle health is, maybe how to track it, things to look out for. Your vitality and longevity is so tied to it, and ways to get that protein in your diet. Now, another area that I think many people may not be aware of, we talk about muscles and you mentioned having myokines. I've been talking about the immune system and cytokines.
Yes.
So how do myokines help our cytokines?
Yeah, right. So this is so cool. This is a great conversation.
Especially when we're going into, we're coming out, we're still in it, right? I can't say we're out of it. We're still in this pandemic, and, we're going into the fall where we're going to see all kinds of viruses and things like that. So what is the immune connection to all of this?
When you contract skeletal muscle, it releases multiple myokines, and myokines, like interleukin 6, which would be considered a bad cytokine, actually has a different impact when it's released from training skeletal muscle.
Really?
Yes. And this is work from Penderson, out of Penderson's lab. She's in Copenhagen. And this research actually started coming out in 2003. And I was so fascinated by this. And I realized that nobody talks about skeletal muscle as an endocrine organ, which skeletal muscle is the largest endocrine organ in the body. When you contract it, it releases these myokines, which counteract the inflammatory cytokines in the body. And that is one of the reasons why training, there's a whole area of science called exercise immunology. And this is a component of it. Yeah. I mean, it's a very new science, but exercise immunology really looks at muscle tissue and its impact on the immune system. So training skeletal muscle in a low fed state. So, in the beginning of our conversation, I talked about the suitcase. So throw all the clothes out of the suitcase, go through periods of fasting, don't eat a bunch of excess calories, and then go train in a quote, low glycogen, low storage state. And you will actually secrete more interleukin 6, which is the myokine that actually goes throughout the body and has an anti-inflammatory effect and augments cells of the immune system.
Fascinating. So much of what I had studied talked about interleukin 6 as being pro-inflammatory.
Yes, depending on if it's released by macrophages. So if interleukin 6 is released by macrophages, it is in fact pro-inflammatory.
Okay.
However, if interleukin 6 or interleukin 10 is released from skeletal muscle, it has a peak and then it decreases and it creates a systemic anti-inflammatory effect.
Wow. Fascinating. We're deep. I know everyone's like,
I'm sorry, but it's so important.
We interleukin and myokine and cytokine land. What's happening here? I find all this so fascinating.
Yeah.
And I know we're about to call time here, but real quickly, you talked about training and resistance training in addition to the protein. Talk to us a little bit about that. Many women fear training, right? And women don't like it. I have to grudgingly say I'm not the biggest fan of training, but I know I need it. So talk to us a little bit about what that looks like, the time allotment, the commitment there. Give us a sense of that.
Let's say that a great place to start is a very well-designed program of 3 to 4 days of resistance training. Depending on how well designed your program is, it could be 45 minutes. And when you think about it, you're investing in your health bank.
Yes.
It's really a non-negotiable. And we have to understand most people don't like lifting weights. It's
Right.
not fun, right? We're also very good creatures of habit. So if we've done yoga or done Pilates, we like to continue to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That is not going to affect your body composition in the same way resistance training is. So 3 to 4 days a week of a very well-designed program. I love high intensity interval training. You could throw in 7 minutes of that. So it's a relatively high max out effort for, it could be a 1-to-1 ratio. It could be for 20 seconds, you go as hard as you can, and then you allow your body to rest.
Right.
Throw that in. If you're untrained, you start 1 day a week, maybe
Wow.
2 days a week.
Are there resources online that you recommend? So many people
Yeah.
are having issues getting out and about. What do you recommend?
I have very incredible trainers. So I'll tell you one, her name is Kara Killian. She's amazing.
Okay.
If your listeners are interested, I am happy to connect her. She would actually be great on your show.
Ooh.
She's a former collegiate athlete, former Titan Games. She's a muscle physiologist. She has her master's, really high quality, good information. If someone is pregnant, they still have to train. So another person I use is Melissa Paris, and I'll give you guys all resources because they're people I trust and they're resources I trust, and they curate very well-designed programs for someone at any stage.
I love that. I know you trained,
Yes.
I know you trained all through your pregnancy.
Yep.
If you guys have seen her, she looks pretty incredible in some of those pictures, but yeah, so all of this is stuff that I think, we just have, I don't know why we put these walls and boundaries up. We think it's not for us. We think it's not important.
Right.
And I think it's because that message of how critical muscle health is. It's almost like, here's the dialogue of the narrative that I've heard. I don't need to worry about my muscle health until I'm 50 plus and I'm worried about my bone health.
Right.
And that's the connection. And by then you're starting to lose your hormones and you're starting to lose so many other factors. And
that's not the time to try to build muscle. The time is now, right?
Now, exactly.
And there is evidence that it's not that you just have to lift heavy. As long as you have a correct amount of volume and that you're going to perceived exhaustion, you're really putting in the effort. Effort here is key.
Mm-hmm.
I used to joke and say you should want to quit at least once in the workout. Otherwise, you're not doing hard enough. But, I think really reframing the conversation, because if you tell yourself something enough, right? Like you said, if it's not for me, if we tell ourselves something enough, we believe it.
We believe it. Yep, absolutely. Well, fabulous information as always. If anyone today wants to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Very active on my Instagram at Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. Also, my website, drgabriellelyon.com, has a ton of information. I even introduced my mentor of 20 years, who's a world-leading class protein expert. World-class protein expert. And I have a free protocol on there for you. I put a ton of effort into it. So it really talks about these concepts and foundational information. And then I have a very active website, newsletter and YouTube channel where I try to provide a ton of content.
I love
so they should sign up. Yeah.
I should. It's all good stuff. And I'm always so thrilled to have you on the show and talk about all your brilliant and innovative ideas and research that you've been putting into practice over the years. So thank you for joining us. And I know we're going to continue these conversations for sure. So for everyone else, thank you for joining this episode of Superwoman Wellness. Remember that we are on Spotify, so rate and review it and share it with your friends. And remember, we're doing this promotion. You get a free bottle of Boost if you do post a review and send it to me at hello@drtaz.com. I will see you guys next time. Stay healthy, stay well, and stay superpowered.